Hey, Braves fans, it's been a little while since I've been with you, but let's be honest, there's just been absolutely no news to talk about with the Braves. So, if I waited forever in this offseason for something to happen, I'd never get back with you. So here we are. We're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about the Braves farm system. And this keeps coming up in my mind because I think it's playing some impact in how active the Braves can be. I think it's limiting them. And I think this has been true of the last, I'd say, at least two off seasons where the Braves just don't have a lot in the farm system that maybe other teams really want. So I think it makes it harder to make the trades. The Braves obviously are less likely to be involved in big free agent signings, so they need to be able to trade. And with a weaker farm system, they just have less to pull from. So I'm going to get into, in this episode, the problem with the Braves farm system. Obviously, I'm setting that up in a pretty negative way. I'm not generally negative entirely on the Braves farm system and what they're doing, but I'll try to parse that out in this episode as we go through the Braves farm system and maybe how it's impacting this offseason. All right, guys, so let's get into this episode talking about the Braves farm system. And again, I'm going to try to link it back to, maybe some of the reasons why the Braves have been a little less active this offseason. I think the farm system is at the very least limiting some of the things they would like to do. It doesn't mean they won't be able to get done some of the big things. I do think January is probably going to be a pretty active time for the Braves, certainly compared to the rest of the offseason, which isn't saying much. But I do think the Braves are going to fill some of these needs that exist. Man, I would be shocked if they just do absolutely nothing all offseason. I guess that is possible, but let's get into it. Okay, so we have to go back just a little bit, a little brief history. And if you're new to the Braves, this is maybe new to you. And if you're not new and you're a big fan, then obviously you know this stuff. But it's good to revisit a little bit. Okay, so when Alex Anthopoulos, the Braves general manager, took over his position after the 2017 season, he was walking into one of the best organizations in baseball, and an organization that was nearing the end of a 4-year rebuild and was being, at the same time, right, there's a lot of good things about you're at the end of the rebuild. You got some young prospects coming up. You've got Freddie Freeman as your cornerstone. You've got some good things happening in the organization. But in that offseason, the Braves were also being hit with penalties from the previous regime's international signing misconduct. Okay, so John Coppolella gets banned from baseball. I mean, this whole deal, which we're not going to rehash all of that. If you go way back into some of my early episodes, I do talk about some of those things a little bit more. But all of that was going on when Alex Anthopoulos comes in. But he takes this job even with the international signing ban because the rest of the job was so good, and he talked about it. He's walking into a team that was going to win soon. I don't think he expected the Braves to immediately turn it around and win the NL East in 2018. They were a surprise team that year. That's also the year that Ronald Acuna comes on, and I mean, just everything kind of worked from there. But he's coming into an organization again that is banned from international signing for several years. So I'm not going to rehash every detail of that whole deal, but the Braves lost multiple young international prospects they had signed during the John Coppolella era. So they lose a lot of players from the lower levels of their farm system, and they were barred from participating in an international signing period for a few years. So the obvious immediate result of that was the lower levels of the Braves system was just raked out, right? They were weakened. It was a weakened farm system, and then was further weakened by several big-time promotions around the same time at the upper levels. Okay, so just before this whole thing went down, you had Dansby Swanson. I'm just going to go through some of these big names that you guys will know just to remember. Dansby Swanson makes his debut in August of 2016. The next year, right at the end of the John Coppolella era, Ozzie Albies and Max Fried made their debuts in August of 2017. Acuna, in April of 2018, makes his debut, and Austin Riley, the next year in May of 2019, made his major league debut. So each of these guys were brought in, again, by the previous regime. Anthopoulos can't really take credit for them being a part of the Braves system, Um, but obviously these guys have played massive dividends for the future, for the success of the franchise, and some of them for the future success of the franchise. Those guys that are still left. So I will say Anthopoulos has done a terrific job in extending Albies and Acuna and Riley. They're obviously a part of this core that still exists for the Braves. Of course, Swanson and most recently Fried have moved on because the market just kind of blew up for them, and there were reasons certainly that the Braves allowed those guys to get closer to free agency and not extend them like they did the other guys. But we're not going to get too much into that in this episode. So while the major league team flourished and has flourished since Anthopoulos' arrival, including, let's say, 6 straight division titles, 7 straight appearances to the playoffs, of course, the 2021 World Series title, the club has never fully rebounded, in my mind, to replenish their minor league system. And to me, this is I'm not going to say failure, but it's maybe the weakness of the Anthopoulos regime since he's come in. And his number one role is to win at the major league level, right? Especially when you have all these stars at the major leagues, right? And so the minor leagues are not the priority, especially if you're in a rebuilding situation like the Braves were in 2015, 2016, 2017. Okay, the minor leagues are a little more the focus, but it's still very important, and we're going to get into some of that in this episode. So yeah, the Braves have had some notable promotions during the Anthopoulos era. Of course, you have Michael Harris and Spencer Strider in 2022. Last year, really importantly, Spencer Schwellenbach comes up. So over the last few seasons, you've had some notable promotions, but the lack of depth of the system is equally notable. I think it's really been highlighted. It was highlighted last season with all the injuries, and the Braves they didn't really have any internal options to turn to. And then even, I think it's still, showing itself in this offseason as well, that the Braves don't have much depth to pull from. They're having to go outside the organization to get some of these depth pieces so far this offseason. So again, there are some legitimate reasons why the Braves minor league depth is weakened, especially for from a position player standpoint. Of course, from the pitching standpoint, the Braves are in pretty good shape. But there are some legitimate reasons for the weakness on the position player part. Again, I've already mentioned the previous international signing ban. It's really still being felt because the Braves didn't fully re-enter the international signing period until 2022. They were able to participate a little bit in 2021. And so those guys, even the guys that they were able to sign at that point, are still quite young. We're talking 19, 20. I think the oldest would be like 21. And then the trades that have been needed to bolster the big league club, the Braves did have to use some prospect capital in those trades. I wouldn't say any of those were like really, big time. But when Freddie Freeman moved on and the Braves had to go get Matt Olson, they did have to use some prospect capital in that one. And a few other more minor moves that has happened as well. And of course, the promotion of several players, like I already mentioned, with Harris and Strider and Schwellenbach. The Braves have always been pretty aggressive in promoting guys they think are ready to go. However, it is still true that during the Anthopoulos era, the Braves system has only developed one positional starter. I mean, I think that's legitimate to talk about. Michael Harris is the only positional starter that the Braves have been able to draft and develop or sign and develop. But of course, Harris came from the draft. Drake Baldwin seems to be on the verge of breaking through, and then Nacho Alvarez, I think, could also be a major league player. But that's about it on the horizon. So it's just a fact that the Braves have not had a lot of positional talent come through the system basically since Austin Riley in 2019. That's kind of amazing to think about. Now, in fairness, there haven't been that many holes to fill for the Braves, right? Since 2021, 2020, it's positionally the Braves have basically been locked down. But this offseason, as we know, the Braves are in need of a left fielder, and really could use an upgrade at shortstop as well. And there are just no real internal solutions there for the Braves. I mean, maybe Nacho Alvarez at shortstop, but he is yet to prove, I think, to the Braves that he can play shortstop. And, maybe he shows up in spring training and he's a new man and can do it. But at this point, it doesn't look like that's the most likely scenario. So while the Braves system has been fairly rich in pitching prospects, they have been weak in positional prospects. It's just true. So let's dig into why that has been and why it matters. All right, so during the Anthopoulos era, it's been obvious, I think, to everyone that the Braves have prioritized drafting pitching while using international signings to acquire positional talent. So yes, they will occasionally draft a position player they really like, such as a Michael Harris, a Drake Baldwin, most recently high school catching prospect Nick Montgomery, who I really like. And they have a good record of drafting positional guys. I mean, it's hit and miss still, but I think considering they're drafting fewer of them, they've gotten some really big hits off of these few guys that they have drafted. But the 2024 draft, it's a good example of how heavily they have been drafting pitchers compared to position players. Only one position player was taken with the Braves' first top 10 picks in the 2024 draft. And again, that was Nick Montgomery, who is a catching prospect out of high school. So on the draft side of things, this strategy has actually proved pretty effective. The Braves have found several major league arms. I mean, Spencer Strider has come out of this strategy. Spencer Schwellenbach has come out of this. They've got quite a few others on the horizon that I'll mention a little later, that are starting to, double A, triple A, and that we could see fairly soon. So that is good, but it's of course a different story on the international side of things. So the Braves seem to have a pretty good scouting system and whatever you want to call it in terms of their draft, but their international signings and scouting and all that have really not come to fruition since they've been able to re-engage the international signings. So their first big international signing after the ban lifted was Ambroyes Tavares. He was a shortstop. This was in 2021. They gave him $1.5 million. They basically put all their eggs in one basket with this guy in 2021. He is just not proven to be much of anything. He is 21 years old at this point. He's in low A. That's as far as he's gotten. He apparently has a really good glove, but he has been terrible offensively, sub 200 player in low A with the Augusta Green Jackets last year. He was, again, the Braves' first big signing coming off of their ban in penalties, and he is just totally not proven himself. He's not even on the Braves' top 30 prospect list anymore. Okay, so in 2022, the Braves had two big international signings, Diego Benitez, who was a top 10 signing at the time, and Douglas Glod. Benitez signed for $2.5 million. Douglas Glod signed for $1.3 million. Benitez, shortstop prospect, has been absolutely terrible offensively. He made it to low A and was eventually demoted back down to rookie ball last year. Glod has yet to turn 20, so he is young, but he was unable to hit over 200 in rookie ball in 2024. Luis Guanipa is an outfield prospect. He was the big signing in 2023. The Braves gave him $2.5 million. Guanipa is only 19, so still very young. He has shown some more flashes of legit talent. With the bat, he struggled mightily in low A in 32 games last year after he had played well early in 2024 at rookie ball. And then Jose Perdomo was the Braves' 2024 big signing, $5 million. That actually might have been the most any team gave out to one player last year. I'd have to check that again. But shortstop prospect, the biggest and most recent big-time Braves signing. Perdomo was barely able to get on the field last year. I think he played 8 games in rookie ball, and then I don't know if it was a hamstring, some kind of injury kept him out after that. So we haven't seen him much. You just can't make too many prognostications about him, and he's still very young. He's only 18, so he could truly still be the real deal, but it's way too soon to tell. So talking about all these guys, they haven't made it yet. I mean, the obvious caveat to that is they're all very young. Um, Now, I do think we've seen enough of Tavares, Benitez, and Glad to be really concerned about them that they would ever make it. It's not that they can't figure things out, but they all look like big swings and misses right now. Guanipa and Perdomo, way too early to tell. Guanipa has shown some encouraging signs, though he hasn't ever really been consistently good as of yet. And again, Perdomo, we just have barely seen. So there's still a ton of promise with those two guys. Maybe something comes of them. Of course, anytime a team engages in international signing, you have these really big names that you're going to throw a lot of money at, and then you're going to have these other lower level international signings for $50,000 or $100,000 that any of those guys could pop out of nowhere. Ronald Acuna was just a $100,000 signing, I'm pretty sure. Ozzie Albies was maybe like a little more than that, but wasn't like in the millions of dollars. So obviously, the Braves got a ton out of those guys, but the only one of those types of players on the radar for the Braves right now is John Gill. I don't know if it's pronounced Gill or Heel, but he is a shortstop, incredibly fast, 80 grade speed. He's had more success at rookie ball in low A than any of these other guys. So obviously, still very young himself. I think he's also still just 18. So we'll have to see, but he signed for $110,000 in 2023. Okay, so all that being said, since the Braves were able to, 4 years ago now, able to re-engage in the international signing period, they just haven't gotten much out of that. I mean, even if these guys were still being this young, if they had just played better, they would have more prospect value that the Braves could trade from if they wanted to trade them. So it's not just that you're not sure internally if they're ever going to turn into something, but no one else is thinking they're going to turn into something either. So they just don't have a lot of prospect value. So these players should remind us that the international pool is basically you're paying for lottery tickets. It's incredibly difficult to project these international players. Now, why is it so much more difficult to project international players compared to, even high schoolers that you're drafting in the major league draft? Well, number one, you're trying to scout and project 15 and 16-year-olds. I mean, if you know anything about the international signing universe, you basically start scouting kids at 12, 13 years old, which is already kind of silly. But if you know anything about young kids, I mean, they all mature physically at very different times. You could be the biggest, strongest 15-year-old, and then you never get any bigger, and guys, outpace you from that point. So you could sign this kid that just looks like a monster when he's 16 to a $5 million signing bonus, and he just never gets bigger, never gets better, while this tiny kid matures later at 17 or 18 years old, and he turns into Ronald Acuna. And that's basically what happened with Acuna. It was hard to see what he would end up being physically, and of course, you include, or you combine that with his natural tools, and he just takes off. So it's incredibly difficult to project these young kids. And the second thing with international pool, why it's so difficult, it's the wild, wild west. This system, it's not a great system. You're entering these countries with extreme poverty. You have some people lying about their age. You have all these different outside influences. I mean, there's a lot of corruption going on down there. I mean, it's all sorts of stuff that you have to deal with. The next thing is, on the player perspective, it's a massive cultural challenge to get pulled from, again, probably an impoverished situation, into, you're pulled out of your country. You don't speak the language. in all of this stuff. And it's really difficult it's not just let's go develop from a baseball perspective, right? It's all these different things that are thrown at these young kids. And it's hard to get out of that and be successful, right? You start thinking how many talented kids have flamed out, not due to ability, but all these other exterior issues, language barrier, homesickness, other struggles that, who even knows? So that is difficult. But you get very few of these international prospects that are so-called can't miss prospects that actually have become big stars. I think Miguel Cabrera is one of the better known who, from a really early age was can't miss and then ends up being, of course, a future Hall of Famer. But this is why I haven't loved the Braves relying so heavily on getting position players from the international pool. It's a crapshoot. Yes, you might occasionally find an Ozzie Albies or Ronald Acuna Jr. or a Juan Soto. And I think, by the way, I don't think Juan Soto was a big time prospect coming out either. But more often than not, you get a Kevin Maitan. And if you're a Braves fan, if you've been one for a while, you might know that name. Kevin Maitan, a part of that international band that the Braves got themselves in. He gets shipped off. I think he ended up with the White Sox, never did anything. And he was their big star prospect coming out of the international system at the time. Baseball is littered with those types of guys who never make it. U.S. players, again, are easier to scout, not only because they are local, but they are older, they're more projectable. Even the high school kids are more projectable, not to mention they don't have the cultural hurdles to overcome. So this does not mean the Braves should abandon the international strategy. It's just don't rely on it, right? Every international player that hits, that's awesome, right? But it's kind of bonus. And you need that stuff to happen some, but you can't rely on it, right? And I really think the Braves should start balancing their draft more. So don't go away from the pitching side of things, but just start balancing the draft a little more where you're drafting more position players, and especially one position where I think the Braves are particularly weak in, and that is shortstop. All right, so while most teams really do prioritize drafting shortstops, the Braves have, for the most part, I mean, just from an outsider's perspective, have seemed to shy away from drafting shortstops in the early rounds. The one exception to this was a few years ago, the Braves drafted Braden Shoemake. He ended up being a big dud, but other than that, they just haven't done it. So one positive with drafting a shortstop is like the preeminent defensive position. And if you can stick there, be good defensively there, and be good offensively there, you're an incredibly valuable player. But if you can't stick at shortstop, you can basically go pretty much anywhere else on the diamond and play it, right? You can be like Chipper Jones and shift over to third. That's one of the more common, or second. If you're probably a little smaller, I mean, you can go over to you can go the outfield. If you know the San Diego Padres, basically their entire team is, at every position is former shortstops, and they're very athletic, and that really showed up when the Braves played them in the postseason, by the way. But the Braves have almost none, right? And really have not drafted shortstop, and when they haven't done it very well. Okay, so the Braves' inability, or maybe unwillingness, to prioritize shortstop, I think has left them with several years of Orlando Arcia, right? Here we are entering season 3, I guess, of the Orlando Arcia era, and no clear succession plan after him. I think he signed, for one more season after this one? So even if they play out his contract, they've got no one behind him that's very obvious, that will take the reins. So what do? I mean, Ha-Seong Kim is still out there as a free agent. He could be a short-term answer, but even if you sign him to a 3-year deal, I don't think that even still bridges the gap to any internal options like John Gill or Jose Perdomo. So maybe a prospect swap. I mentioned this idea with an outfielder in one of my previous episodes. So maybe the Braves could trade, a Hurston Waldrop for another team shortstop prospect that they really like, or package a couple together to get a guy that, a team that already has a shortstop in place at the big league level, but they have another talented shortstop prospect. Maybe you can go out and do something like that. And, amazingly, the same is true for the Braves with the outfield as well. The Braves minor league outfield depth is very weak. The Braves have two outfielders in their top 30 prospects, and there are two guys I've already mentioned that are very far away from the majors, Guanipa and Glad, 19 and 20 years old. They might not ever even make it to the major leagues. It's like, how is this possible? You have three outfielders at every level, and so you have more opportunity, right, to draft and play outfielders and develop them, and yet the Braves they don't have one outfielder on the radar coming up. No real talent at that position in the minors. So outfield and shortstop is not just weak at the major league level, it's really weak at the minor league level too. So that's why it's particularly troubling, and why I think if the Braves could address maybe one at the major league level and kind of get that one in place for a little while, great. But they're going to have to really attack both of these positions in building up their organizational depth at both of these positions in the future. But as they say, you typically can always go find an outfielder. You can't always find a shortstop. And that's why it's so important to draft and develop shortstops. You always want multiple options in your system, and the Braves just do not have that. So let me be clear. I've been kind of negative in this episode on the Braves and their minor league system. Let me be really clear, if I haven't already been. The Braves have done a great job drafting, signing, and developing pitchers. They've even got some international guys that they didn't give much money to that are starting to pop at the minor league level as well. And, you don't typically shop for a lot of pitchers in the international signings because they're so young. It's just, again, so hard to project pitchers at that age. But the Braves have hit on a few of those. So that's great, right? They have a ton of pitching prospects, even beyond A.J. Smith-Shawver or Hurston Waldrop or their recent draftee, Cam Caminiti. They've got Drew Hackenberg at AAA. They got J.R. Ritchie at AA. They've got Owen Murphy. Yeah, he's undergoing Tommy John, but I think he made it to AA. Giancarlo Lara, he's one of those international signees. He's at AAA. Garrett Bauman is at higher A ball. Blake Burkhalter is at Rome High A, and Didier Fuentes is at Low A. All of these guys are like really encouraging pitching prospects that the Braves have. So they've done a great job on the pitching side of things, but I think it's been to the detriment of their positional player pool in the minor league. So the Braves are pitching rich and they're position player poor in the minor leagues. It's just a fact. And again, they're so good at the major league level that, hey, you feel like you don't need a ton of positional minor leaguers. But I really think that's kind of a fallacy, because what 2024 certainly taught us is, okay, you can have a great major leaguer. If he gets injured, you need next man up. And oh no, we don't have a next man. We have no one here behind this guy. And then you got to scramble and try to go after someone at the trade deadline and just try to survive before that. And it's really, I think, caused the Braves to suffer in those situations. So we saw that in 2024, and thus far in 2025. I mean, you see Anthopoulos is definitely building up. It seems like he's building up a AAA roster full of cast-offs that are maybe a little better than what the Braves had organizationally, for depth in 2024. But obviously, they're not getting you too excited, and they're not long-term solutions. Okay, so again, why does all this matter? Let me try to encapsulate this. The Braves have an obvious positional hole right now in left field to fill, and one other weak point on their roster at shortstop, where an upgrade is, I think, needed. And at present, they cannot do it internally. There are no real options unless you could consider Nacho Alvarez an option at shortstop. But I really don't think the Braves consider him a shortstop. Um, and even if he could change their minds on that, his offensive profile, I think, is somewhat limited. I mean, if Nacho could play short, I would prefer him over Arcia, certainly. I just am not buying that is going to happen. So that's the first thing, right? They have these obvious holes that they can't fill internally. Number two, the Braves are also having a hard time filling these holes by trading for them. Because again, they are not rich in prospects at the upper levels, and that's where you pull some prospects together and you go out and trade for a major league ready guy. Several teams that would be trade partners are looking for position player prospects, like the White Sox and the Mariners, and the Braves don't have any outside of Drake Baldwin. And reports are that the Braves don't want to part with Drake Baldwin. I don't blame them. I really like Drake Baldwin. Number three, again, you need talented prospects ready to contribute when injury happens. If the Braves have an injury at any position right now, they're screwed. Just like in 2024. They will have to go outside the organization to get any kind of long-term fix, just like they did last season. Okay, so, again, Anthopoulos, in a lot of ways, he's done great things. I have a lot of faith in him. I'm not calling for Anthopoulos to be fired or anything like that. I think that would be silly. But I do think they need to get better in this area. I think it's a fair criticism to say, okay, positionally at the minor league level, you guys have not done a good job generally, right? There's Michael Harris, okay, great, but outside of that, there hasn't been a lot of success. So it's time to dig into that a little more. I think they need to start taking a more balanced approach with their drafts to find some more positional talent, especially at shortstop. Or guys, before we know it, Ozzie Albies and Ronald Acuna, the first two guys of the core to hit free agency a few years from now, are going to be out the door, and there's not going to be anyone there of substance to take their place. And that's when the Braves go from being a top-tier team to a middle-of-the-road team, or even a team that's pivoting back to rebuilding because they don't have the prospects to reload. And you've seen the Dodgers, I think, more than any other team, be very successful at this, right? Being great at the major league level, but constantly reloading at the minor league level and developing guys too. And I think it's, you look at them and you're like, hey, we could do that, right? We might never be able to spend $700 million for Shohei Ohtani or for Juan Soto, but the rest of it, the Braves should be doing, and I think they can get back to it, but they need to. And, it's really exciting when you get a young, talented prospect to come up, and it's also incredibly valuable, right? A 22-year-old talented shortstop is one of the most valuable things any major league team can have, because we've seen when they get to free agency like Dansby Swanson, they're crazy expensive, and every team wants it. So hopefully the Braves can get around to that, but I do think some of the slowness of the offseason, beyond the free agents being so expensive, part of the slowness of the offseason has been the Braves have a very small window of players that they can choose from in terms of trades, because they just don't have a ton of prospect capital to use. So it's a problem that I think they've in part created for themselves, and they're going to have to dig themselves out of that. And they're only going to do that through good drafts and, maybe also hitting on a few of these international prospects, which hopefully will, come to fruition. We'll know a lot more as we get into the year. We can see some of these young guys play. I don't think the Braves, from a long-term perspective, are going to have too big of a problem in terms of pitching, but it's time to deal with this weakness at the positional in the positional sphere for their minor league system. All right, guys. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Stay the Braves. hopefully some news will hit soon and the Braves will start getting active here in the off season. And when that happens, I'll come back and talk about it. All right. Talk to you guys later.